unknown secrets of the enigmas of Egypt, right? That there's this sort of murky, unknown, smoky, incense-filled, tomb-laden quality to Egypt that's mysterious, right? That sort of draws us to it because of its unknowability, its strangeness to us, its sort of enigmatic nature. But I don't think I've ever been to an exhibit on Greek or Roman art that's called The Secrets of the Mysteries of Roman Portraiture, or the unknown magical qualities of black figure Greek vase painting. And that's telling, right? That even today, we still frame Egypt, which we know a lot about, whose language we can read, right, pretty much completely, right? That somehow still is an unknown to us.
Amazing.
And so I think that Egypt continues to draw us for that reason. And again, at the museum, it's incredible. Room after room after room after room after room of amazingly well-preserved sculpture, painting, decorative arts from Egypt. Incredible.
And this is to satisfy my own curiosity. You do know about this by definition much more deeply than I ever could. Correct me if I'm wrong. Hegel, the German philosopher, who was also an art historian in his own right, or a philosopher of art history, as you say, had difficulty with historically locating Egypt. When he was mystified and mesmerized by its greatness, he was fond of arguing that it couldn't have possibly been an African civilization.
Right. Well, I mean, this is one of these interesting things that we could never do. Right? But let's say hypothetically, we could just imagine here, sitting on these couches, that the pyramids were in Belgium. Let's just say hypothetically. Just outside of Brussels are the 3 pyramids. This is a much different conversation, right? That I think that Western cultures could go to bed much easier if these enormously impressive monuments were in Europe.
I see.
And not in Africa, right? That it bugs us, that it gets in the way of Greece, right? Of that being, I wouldn't argue and would never argue that what happens in Greece in the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries BCE is not of colossal importance for the history of the world and the history of the Mediterranean and for the foundation of many of our thoughts today on politics, on philosophy, on arts for that matter. But Egypt is troublesome, right? And I think that we would be naive to say that there is not some inherent sort of institutional racism that has gone on, not just in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, but in many ways that we still are living with that legacy and how that material is taught. You know, we can expose our students to these difficulties, but it doesn't make the difficulties go away in what they're going to read. And even at the MFA, although I'm hoping that this is going to be changed, the identification of the pharaohs, right, on the museum labels are in Greek. Right?
Amazing.
Even though we know their Egyptian names, right?
They're in Greek.
They're in Greek. Right. So Menkore, who's the guy who made it to my list, an unbelievable funerary portrait of Menkore and his consort from around 2500 BCE or so, in Greek was Mycerinus, right? And that's still how he's labeled, right? I mean, until we have the Rosetta Stone and the translation of hieroglyphs in the 19th century, most of our knowledge about ancient Egypt came from Greeks, right? From the Greek historians, and so we know their Greek names, right? And you know, the MFA still. Right. Although now that they're redoing the museum, I'm assuming that that's going to be changing. But you know, we can go walk, you know, to the museum tomorrow and go look at Greek names for Egyptian pharaohs, even though we know they're Egyptian names. Right. And so that's just one tiny little bit of sort of insight into that. You know, we are still dealing with that legacy, right, today, and how we deal with these things.
No wonder then, truly, from the depth of my heart, I can't praise what I just heard enough. No wonder then why, to go back to teaching now, as I promised the audience, why some of your students have been driven to say has something like this that made me jealous. Ras is by far the most amazing teacher I have ever had in my entire life, period. Extremely interesting class. He just knows everything. He makes you understand history and its meaning. He's just awesome. You cannot let yourself not have a class with him. Another student adds, I can't say enough about Ras. You learn lots of information without ever trying. That is honestly how good of a teacher he is. He's extremely passionate, funny, adorable, and amazingly comprehensive. You won't regret taking one of his classes. That is for sure, if only all of Berkeley's teachers were of this caliber. The most amazing and inspiring teacher I've had yet in my life. Ras is an amazing teacher. If you can take art history with him, do it. Very animated and extremely knowledgeable in the subject. Many trips to the MFA. Great guy. Now, what you were just telling me about Egypt is so complex. And yet, how do you make it interesting and intelligible for these musicians at Berkeley who have better things to do? Why should they give a damn about the mysteriousness of ancient Egypt, particularly if they can't make a readily understandable, concrete case of its importance in their musical lives? How do you do it?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the, I don't know if decisions is the right way of putting this, because I can't remember a conscious moment that I decided this. But when I first started teaching in Berkeley, and I've had some experience teaching in other places in and around Boston, that I've never treated Berkeley students any different than I treated students at the other places that I've taught. And I think that for some of our colleagues, although not as much anymore, that when you teach to musicians, that it's a bad way to start, right? Because essentially what you're doing is you're setting up a dynamic that says, okay, here's a very complex subject, but because you're just a musician, right, I'm going to teach it to you in this really facile, superficial way so you can understand it, so you'll be interested in it as a musician. That is an extraordinarily poor way of going about teaching. If there's one thing that I found, not just at Berkeley, but I think generally, is that students will rise to the level at which they're taught. And so, number one is you challenge them, and you treat them like the sophisticated, curious adults that they are, because they are. Right? And I think that for many of the students, to sort of relate this to something that I was saying earlier, that they respect being treated as intellects, and that they'll rise to the high level at which they're taught, because they're smart, and they're curious, and they're passionate. If you continue to say this is art history for musicians, this is philosophy for non-majors, this is, psychology for poetry majors, or whatever it is, that you do a disservice to your discipline, but of infinitely more importance, you do a disservice to the students.
As a human
that is, you set very high expectations, you deal with the material in a sophisticated way, and they, not only do they appreciate it, they learn more, and they become more interested in it. And again, I think that one of the elements that came out of this, the thing that you were reading earlier, is, I think art history in general does have some parallels, and the example that I used was very deliberate, being at Berkeley, with classical music. So I know very little about classical music. I know what I like, I know what I don't like. Right? But when you go to Symphony Hall as a casual, enthusiast of classical music, and you put on your jackets, and you go and you look at the menu of what's playing, and you look at the brochure, and you see all of these composers whose names you know, I'm not